Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar on the Fifth National Climate Assessment, Chapter 8 on ecosystems, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. We very much appreciate everyone coming today and showing your interest in our chapter. We had a great team working together on this chapter with a lot of expertise over the last nearly 3 years. And a selection of the team is here to present the chapter to you today. So I'm Pam McAwee. I'm at Rutgers University. I served as chapter lead for this chapter. And with me today, we have a few of the authors that worked on the chapter. So we have Steve Hamilton, who's recently retired from Michigan State and also working with the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies. Jen Costanza from the U.S. Forest Service. Kofi Akamani from Southern Illinois University. Niffer Wilkening from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Guillaume Shrestha from Carboneers. We also today have Aaron Grade, who served with us as an important U.S. Global Research Program support staff for our chapter, and I'm going to turn it over to Aaron now to discuss some of the elements of the NCA process.
Thank you, Pam, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. Thank you for being here. As mentioned, my name is Aaron Grade, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment team here at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started with this webinar, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Eliza, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Ecosystem Chapter authors. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 federal agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. The same law that established our program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. The NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was ran by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, and several government science reviews. Now let's dive in a bit and look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics like ecosystems, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. All right, now that we've gone through some introductory background, it's my pleasure to hand it back over to Pam, the chapter lead of the ecosystems chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of our webinar today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. So just to give a little bit of background to how we approached our chapter, we started off thinking of some overarching themes, and the work that we ended up doing, we encapsulated in 3 key messages corresponding to our chapter title related to ecosystems, species, and ecosystem services. But before we get to those key messages, I want to present a little bit about some of those overarching themes that we tried to focus the chapter on. Because there are other chapters of the NCA also focused on specific ecosystems, like forests in Chapter 7 or oceans in Chapter 10, we wanted our focus in the ecosystems chapter, Chapter 8, to be on broad patterns of changes that we could understand across multiple ecosystem types. We also wanted to stress the important and holistic links between ecosystems, species, and people, noting our dependence on the many benefits that we get from nature, from clean air that we breathe, to water that we drink, to the physical and mental benefits that we get from ecosystems. So this schematic, our figure 8.1, which opens the chapter, shows some of these broad relationships and issues that we tackled, which is that climate change combines with other stressors. It's not the only stressors on some of our ecosystems, some of which are overexploited or subject to other changes. And those impacts, those combined impacts, are experienced across ecosystems, species, ecosystem services, and human well-being in different ways. So we can try to adapt to many of these changes, but there are limits to both ecosystems and species abilities to adapt, as well as our own as humans to help ecosystems adapt, as well as to help ourselves, particularly in terms of adjusting to the pace and scope of all of these climate impacts. We also noted that we could use ecosystems to help us mitigate, that is to reduce carbon emissions or increase carbon sink capacities. But again, there are limits to what we can do. So next slide, please. We also noted that we see these impacts occurring in every region of the US. So the regional chapters of the NCA each examine specific changes that are occurring in ecosystems across species and within ecosystem services. And we summarize some of those regional impacts in this map, and that can help direct readers to those regional chapters to find out a little bit more. So as an example, in ecosystem changes, we have permafrost thaw and erosion in Alaska, indicating tipping points and possible irreversibility. While for species changes, the Hawaii chapter discusses avian extinction risk in relation to the spread of avian malaria. For ecosystem services changes in the Midwest, ice fishing is at risk and the recreational benefits of this threatened by warming winters. So with that broad overview, I want to turn over to our 3 key messages, starting with key message 1, and Steve Hamilton will take over from here.
Okay, thank you, Pam, and hello, everybody. This message is all about how climate change is driving rapid ecosystem transformations. And I emphasize the word is because this is happening now. It's not just predicted in the future. And we found many examples across many different kinds of ecosystems. This could include loss of key species or even conversion to other ecosystem states. And naturally, there's serious implications, not just for nature, but for human well-being. We'll hear more about that later. We also documented how many types of extreme events are increasing in frequency and or severity. And these can trigger abrupt ecosystem changes, which tend to be negative for nature and people. And we'll hear more about adaptive governance and the importance of adaptive management to try to prepare for, respond to, and alleviate these impacts. Next slide, please. I want to spend a couple minutes on this chart. If you've followed the climate change reports over the years, you've seen similar diagrams. But basically, it's showing how impacts and risks increase with each incremental increase in global warming. So on the far left, we have a temperature scale, and that's the global surface temperature change compared to the pre-industrial period. So it starts at 0. And over the last decade, it's averaged about 1.1 degrees C, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, notably, this last year, 2023, broke all the records and increased by approximately 1.5 degrees C. So well above the gray line showing the average for the last decade. Now, the colors of the bars show risks, with yellow being moderate, red high, and purple very high. And it's divided into terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems on the left and marine ecosystems on the right. Looking on the left, we can see that biodiversity and ecosystem structure are already at moderate risk in this range of 1.1 to 1.5 degrees where we find ourselves. And we're also, of course, seeing wildfire increases and loss of important carbon stocks, not just from wildfires, but things like permafrost melting. Looking on the right at marine ecosystems, you can see that warm water corals are already in serious trouble. And of course, you've probably heard about the degradation of corals all over the tropics and subtropics all over the world. Kelp forests, seagrass meadows, and the epipelagic zone, which is the surface waters of the ocean, are already in the moderate risk zone. So the point here is that we're going to see, with each incremental increase in global average temperature, we're seeing increase in risks and impacts, and consequently, to the extent that we can reduce those temperature increases, we can help reduce the risks and impacts. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Jen Costanzo with the U.S. Forest Service, and I'll be diving in a bit on some of the examples we put together on transformational changes. And as Steve mentioned in the key message here, we're already seeing these changes occurring. So here we use this example of the sagebrush shrublands in the Western US to illustrate again how this transformational change due to both climate change in combination with some local drivers has played out. And these three panels you see in kind of a triptych illustrate this transformation. And the left-hand panel is a native shrubland ecosystem. You see kind of sparse vegetation of these sagebrush shrubs. So this ecosystem supports native wildlife, biodiversity, livestock grazing. So all those kind of ecosystem services that Steve mentioned as well in the first key message. And then you see this transformation occurring to the middle of this diagram, overgrazing by livestock combined with invasion of non-native grasses that burn more frequently, like cheatgrass and others, lead to more frequent wildfire for one thing, and kind of this, what scientists call this grass fire cycle. So the grasses burn more frequently, so the shrubs can't survive in the frequent wildfire. And at the same time, we see climate changing happening at the top here. Climate change leading to longer growing season, drier conditions, shifts in the moisture cycle, which exacerbate wildfires and reduce habitat suitability for some of the non-native species. So the ecosystem has transformed here in the middle and can't provide the same ecosystem services. Soil erosion often happens, there's lower biodiversity, and grazing can't be supported. And this transformation, again, scientists have documented this across broad extents of the West. And in some places, this transformation can be fairly abrupt, occurring over the span of just a couple years. And so this middle kind of shows that the ecosystem has passed what we call a tipping point, and where, so in the third panel here, even if you remove the invasive grass and seed with native species, the soil erosion that has occurred and this kind of cycle of hotter fires combined with climate change that, of course, remains, will not result in restoration of the native ecosystem. And so the result is, inability to support these ecosystem services, and it's in some cases impossible, if not very difficult, to restore. Next slide. And so here we kind of take a step back in figure 8.7 and kind of put that sagebrush example in the context with some other examples we looked at, some of the more notable examples of ecosystem transformations that have been documented due to climate change and other related stressors. And the research documenting many of these transformations and their drivers, I'd say, has really proliferated since the last NCA. So that's one reason why we wanted to really emphasize that in this key message. So the examples we have here span both terrestrial and marine, and really have occurred in all regions of the US, and also from sort of tropical and temperate systems all the way to Arctic systems in Alaska. So again, kind of starting at the top right here, we see that sagebrush example. But then we have some marine examples. So the picture right below that, kind of moving kind of clockwise right below that, and then the two at the bottom are marine examples. So we have a temperate marine example being altered by warming, and then subsequent invasion of tropical organisms that transform those ecosystems. And coral reefs, as Steve mentioned, and many of you have probably heard, are being lost due to warming and ocean acidification. And then in the Arctic, marine ecosystems are being altered by ocean acidification as well, along with algal blooms. So moving back up to the kind of right-hand column, coastal forests on the Gulf Coast and then the Atlantic coast are being converted to ghost forests, which have been in the news, which some of you may have heard of, but also to shrublands and marsh, and that's occurring across really broad extents on the coast. And then flipping kind of to the left of that, in the Great Plains, grasslands are being converted to woodlands due to woody encroachment, due to warming and increased CO2 in the atmosphere. And then above that Great Plains example is dry forests, and often these are conifer forests in the west. After they experience wildfire, along with drought, are becoming grasslands and shrublands because the trees can't regenerate. And then coastal grasslands are being transformed by woody plants due to fire suppression and warming. And here warming kind of can really limit the ability for managers to implement prescribed fire, and so get subsequent transformation to more of a woody ecosystem there. And so all of these examples, and there are many more, kind of show that these transformations are already occurring. And in all these cases, there are impacts to the ecosystem services these ecosystems provide, such as carbon, water cycles, wildlife habitat, and opportunities for recreation. Next slide.
Thank you. My name is Kofi Akamani, and I'm from Southern Illinois University. And so my co-authors have highlighted the observed and anticipated impacts of climate change on ecosystems and species and human societies, particularly the emphasis on abrupt and transformative changes that may be irreversible with potential negative consequences. And so these observations have really highlighted the shortfalls of the conventional approach to managing natural resources, which in the past tended to be top-down, expert-driven, and focused on maintaining a predictable supply of valuable commodities, whether we're talking about timber or recreation or water yield. And so these insights have led to the search for alternative ways of managing natural resources in the context of climate change. And a big one is the idea of adaptive governance, which my colleague Steve Hamilton talked about. And so the adaptive governance approach emphasizes the use of multi-level institutions and institutional mechanisms or decision-making frameworks that connect different kinds of actors across multiple skills in an ongoing process of learning and adapting to change. And so a big part of adaptive governance is adaptive management. And adaptive management is based on the notion that uncertainty, ecosystems are characterized by uncertainties. And so what we know about the system might not always be accurate. And so there's a need for learning as part of the management process. And so adaptive management really emphasizes learning through experimentation, monitoring, and other mechanisms to reduce uncertainty and to build resilience in the system. And so in practice, adaptive management takes many forms. Some are evolutionary, some are active and some are passive. And so passive forms of adaptive management tend to follow mostly a rational, comprehensive approach to planning. And so this framework on the left, although it was developed in a different context, illustrates some of the key stages that we tend to find in a planning cycle that is used in adaptive management processes. And so there's a stage for identifying and defining problems. There's a stage for generating and testing alternatives. There's a stage for implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation with the aim that new insights will be fed back into subsequent planning processes. And so adaptive management has received a lot of application, but it has also been critiqued a little bit. That yes, the focus is on learning, but there's inadequate consideration of the institutions and some of the social issues that are entailed in the management processes. There's also the notion that adaptive management the management trajectory does not fundamentally change because there's a notion that the drivers of the system dynamics are essentially stable. And so there's a notion of stationarity in the discussion on adaptive management that doesn't make it very suitable for managing in the context of transformative changes. And so a more recent framework known as the RAD framework, the Resist, Accept, and Direct framework, developed by Dave Cole and some colleagues from the University of Montana, offers a range of management options, including resisting the directions of change, which essentially is about maintaining the current or historical conditions of the ecosystem, accepting change, which really is about embracing changing the forces of change and accepting the resulting outcomes. Or there's also the stage of the directing change, where the idea is to embrace the fact that change will always occur, but management focus is to intervene in the management process to ensure that system transformation occurs towards a more desirable state. And so it's possible to combine the different strategies, the resisting, accepting, and directing across different temporal and spatial scales. And so the figure on the right tends to illustrate the different kinds of, the combination of these different approaches. And so for the top one, where we are faced with a relatively moderate or weak force driver of change, we can accept the change and then introduce other responses along the way, like resist and direct. But where the forces of change tend to be very strong, it is encouraged that we might opt to resist change initially to buy time for employing other kinds of management options. And so we've seen the application of these different approaches across different wildlife refuges within the US. More recently, there's an effort to integrate the RAD framework within an adaptive management process. And so it is an ongoing experimental process. And again, we've seen the application on the wildlife refuge in Nevada, in the state of Nevada. Next slide.
Okay, sorry about that. I think I was having a problem unmute there. Thanks, Kofi. So I'm Niffer Wilkening. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a research ecologist for the National Wildlife Refuge System. So that was a great segue. Thanks, Kofi. I'm going to be talking about our second key message and providing some related examples. So our second key message is that species changes and biodiversity loss are accelerating. Climate change is interacting with other stressors to cause biodiversity loss, changes in species distribution and life cycles, and increasing impacts from invasive species and diseases. And all of these things have economic and social consequences. Future responses of species and populations will depend on the magnitude and the timing of these changes, along with the differential sensitivity of organisms. And so many species that cannot easily relocate or are highly temperature sensitive may face a heightened extinction risk with continued climate change. Identification of these risks will help prioritize species and locations for protection and improve options for management. Next slide. Short-term extreme events can have severe impacts on threatened species, and two examples of these kinds of impacts are shown here. So the first example that's depicted in the figure labeled A and B shows that high water temperatures off Southeast Florida exceeded the maximum average monthly temperatures in 2014 and 2015. And this resulted in severe bleaching of pillar coral colonies and subsequent disease and death of all individuals. And then the second example, which is shown in C and D on this figure, depicts how wildfires impacted more than 75% of the breeding pairs of Mexican spotted owls in New Mexico in 2012. Next slide. Climate change is leading to shifts in both phenology and range for species across the United States. And so what we're seeing is that many plant and animal species are shifting to higher elevations, shifting to more northern latitudes, or shifting in multiple directions, which we've labeled here on this figure as regional advancement. The timing of seasonal activity is similarly shifting in response to warmer temperatures and changing precipitation regimes. And so in many cases, what we're seeing is that things are occurring earlier in the year, but the direction and the magnitude of changes are species specific, and it does vary across the United States. Next slide. And many damaging invasive species are expected to shift in range because of climate change. And we're showing just a few examples here, but there's many more examples out here. So the photo labeled A shows hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an insect that causes the die-offs of eastern hemlock trees. And this insect is expected to spread northward with warmer winters. B is a picture of an invasive carp, and this species is expected to benefit from warmer waters and expand into the Great Lakes, where they will compete with native fishes and present boating hazards. C shows Eurasian water milfoil, and this vegetation chokes freshwater systems and outcompetes native in warmer conditions. And then finally, D is a picture of a European green crab, an invasive European green crab, and this species harms economically important native shellfish fisheries. And this species is also expected to benefit from warmer waters. Next slide.
Great, thank you. So our last key message is on ecosystem services. And for ecosystem services, as we've mentioned, as we see these transformational changes in ecosystems and changes with species, we also see variable patterns of trends, really depending on what the ecosystem service is and the region, but many of these are negative. And we note in the chapter that these ecosystem service changes will have impacts on human health, on economics, on cultural benefits, and other sectors. We particularly noted that there's uneven impacts on communities of color and tribal communities, and those in low income and rural areas. So many of those folks already have disproportionately lower access to ecosystem services benefits anyway, and climate stressors on top of that are likely to have even more disproportionate impacts. So we note that nature-based solutions, which are those that are designed to use ecosystems to help with human well-being, whether we're protecting or managing or restoring those ecosystems, can provide a lot of climate and adaptation and mitigation benefits if they're well-designed with equity in mind and with the participation of supportive communities. So next slide, please.
Hello, thanks, Pam. My name is Gami Shrestha from Carboneers. So here we talk a bit more about nature-based solutions, and as Pam mentioned, I'll talk more about that. Nature-based solutions are actions to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems to address societal challenges such as climate change. We also refer to them as nature-climate solutions in many other literature and scientific papers. The examples that we present here in the National Climate Assessment are the first one, oyster restoration, the second one, cover cropping, the third one, stormwater management, and the fourth one, urban agriculture. So these types of nature-based solutions they don't only buffer the impacts of climate change, such as through the provision of physical barriers or by improving local microclimates, but they also provide additional benefits like food and habitat provisioning. And this figure specifically presents the other benefits or co-benefits, as many of us refer to them, under each of these examples, such as reducing runoff after storm and extreme precipitation events, or providing cooling, or improving water quality. So these are ecosystem-based mitigation and adaptation opportunities, and they often support biodiversity and can provide other benefits when managed in collaboration with affected communities, local communities, and by the use of local community knowledge. So throughout the chapter and also throughout the report, we provide several examples of such types of benefits, mitigation and adaptation benefits by sequestering carbon and decreasing coastal flooding and wave action and erosion, for instance, while also improving water quality and increasing habitat biodiversity. So nature-based solutions projects are often very cost-effective and have spurred new financing options. Next slide, please. So in our chapter and in this figure, we present this figure, which further discusses the advantages of nature-based solutions and how they can support carbon storage while also providing other benefits. So we discuss how nature-based solutions can preserve or enhance carbon storage in soils and biomass across natural systems like forests, grasslands, and wetlands, as well as agricultural lands. The different approaches of nature-based solutions vary in their climate mitigation potential, in their greenhouse gas mitigation potential, as shown here as teragrams of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for those of you in the audience, 1 teragram equals 100,000 megagram. And 1 megagram equals 0.000001 teragram, 10 to the power minus 6 teragram. So in this figure, what we're trying to show, and again, this figure has been adapted from Farjan et al. To meet the purpose of the assessment. So here, the lighter green shades indicate the estimated portion of mitigation achievable for less than $10, $50, or $100 per megagram of carbon dioxide equivalent. The dark green maximum category shows the highest technical carbon sequestration potential that is also consistent with meeting human needs for food and fiber. The black lines are error bars, indicating either the 95% confidence interval or an uncertainty range, depending on the source of the estimate. The arrow indicates a range that may exceed the values on the chart. And here we also present some other potential benefits of nature-based solutions for each category in the colored dots. And so these include air quality benefits, biodiversity benefits, soil quality benefits, and water quality benefits. So current and future opportunities for nature-based solutions are plenty across the United States, and particularly for mitigation solutions focused on carbon storage by nature ecosystems. And this is quite a hot topic even nowadays. We refer to this as maybe carbon removal or greenhouse gas mitigation or greenhouse gas removal or methane removal. And here in the chapter and also throughout the assessment, the team has tried to assess this for the contiguous US and I mean, so for the entire United States. This particular figure represents the contiguous US potential. So one thing that we stress in this chapter is that planning for future protected areas are both climate for both climate and biodiversity could emphasize areas that not only hold large amounts of carbon, but also help local species adapt, recognizing the important role that many animal species play in carbon cycling. However, nature-based solutions themselves are also vulnerable to rising temperatures, sea level rise, and other climate impacts. Next slide, please. And I think Pam is going to talk about the chapter team next.
Great, thank you so much. We want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions. So I just briefly want to point out that we had a large chapter team. Not everyone is represented on the call today. We had a number of technical contributors who were able to provide their expertise to our team. We also had support from USGCRP. And so we really appreciate everybody's efforts. The chapter team encompassed both federal agencies and scientists, as well as academics, and the private sector. And all of these were incredibly helpful for us to put the chapter together. So I think we have one more slide, and then I think we'll turn it to Erin to moderate the Q&A for our session. So we encourage people to get online to get the NCA chapters. You can see the URL right here so that you're able to access the chapter in full and use it. So Erin, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. And we're getting some praise and hand claps